Bought my family expensive Christmas gifts, but their cruel prank on me, and my girlfriend made me take everything back, even from the kids. I returned to my hometown in December, the roads edged with frost and familiar street corners I used to avoid. After years of distance from my family, something inside me convinced me to close that gap, at least for one holiday. I had done well in the last few years, built a comfortable life, bought a house that still felt too quiet. Maybe giving generous gifts would smooth the edges of the past. Maybe I wanted to show them I was no longer the struggling version of myself they remembered. The thought lingered as a question I preferred not to answer directly. Lila sat beside me in the car, her fingers tracing the fog on the window like she was drawing a beginning instead of a memory. She had always longed for a family moment that felt gentle. When she said, "Maybe this year feels different, Ethan. Maybe we get a soft beginning," there was a fragile hope in her voice. I nodded and pretended my chest did not tighten. I wanted to believe her optimism would carry us through the night, that maybe my family had changed, that maybe I had changed too. The driveway to Richard and Carol's house was lined with lights, sparkling in a pattern that looked more polished than anything they used to put up. Before we stepped out, I reminded myself of the single boundary I had set. When they opened the door, the warmth rolled over us along with voices that sounded too bright. After the greetings, I pulled my parents aside and said quietly, "No pranks. Not on me, not on Lila. Not this year." Carol raised her hands as if I was accusing her of a crime she had not committed. Richard forced an easy laugh. Mark swaggered into the hallway, slapped me on the shoulder and said, "Relax bro, we're grown adults." Something in the tone made me pause, a slight curl at the edge that felt rehearsed. Inside, everything looked coordinated, almost staged. The decorations matched. The tree was perfectly arranged. Even the arrangement of chairs felt deliberate. Lila gave my hand a light squeeze and whispered, "Why do I feel like they rehearsed this?" Her voice held an uneasiness that echoed my own. I answered with a small smile. Because they probably did. Hoping humor would soften the tension that had begun to coil low in my stomach. The evening's chatter rose around us, and I tried to settle into the rhythm of familiar walls and familiar faces. The children rushed past carrying ornaments, their laughter echoing down the hall. Carol hovered with a tray of snacks, insisting we eat. Richard asked about my job with stiff politeness that felt unlike him. Everything had the same shape as the home I once knew, yet none of it felt lived in. It felt like a performance arranged for our benefit, one I could not quite understand. Lila walked among the decorations with the careful wonder of someone trying to fit into a space she had no blueprint for. She kept glancing at me, checking if I felt what she felt. I kept telling myself that this was what reconnecting looked like. A bit awkward, a bit strained, but possible. My family laughed a little too loudly, complimented a little too quickly, moved with a sync that did not match their usual chaotic style. I tried to interpret this as effort rather than warning. We carried the wrapped gifts to the living room and arranged them around the tree. I stepped back to admire how full it looked. It felt good in a small way, imagining the surprise on everyone's faces when they opened what I had chosen. Maybe this would be the bridge I needed, something that brought us back together, at least for one night. Lila knelt to adjust a ribbon on one of the boxes, her face soft with anticipation. As I straightened the last package, I heard footsteps behind me, then a low whisper that sliced through the calm I had been trying to build. Mark's voice drifted close to my ear, directed at someone behind him, too quiet to be part of the room's chatter. Round one starts when he least expects it. The moment we stepped back into the living room, a burst of color shot across my vision. Jets of silly string exploded from both sides, hitting my jacket, my hair, my face. Mark stood grinning with a can in each hand. Noah shrieked with excitement as he sprayed at our legs, and even my mother joined in with a laugh that carried an edge. The smell of chemicals settled in the air, sharp enough to sting my nose. The room echoed with laughter, but the sound felt pointed. There was no warmth in it, only a kind of pleasure taken at someone else's expense. Lila stood completely still, as streaks of string clung to her scarf. The playfulness the family expected to see never appeared on her face. Instead, she looked stunned, her expression hollow, her body stiff. It was the look someone gives when they cannot decide whether to run or hide. Her eyes darted toward the door, toward the kitchen, toward anywhere that was not here. When I whispered, "It's okay. Just breathe," her hands trembled so hard I could feel the shaking through her sleeve. Carol waved a hand as if brushing away our reaction. She said, "Oh, relax, dear, you should have seen Ethan when he was little. We've always done this," her voice lilting as though nostalgia could excuse the discomfort. Lila attempted a smile, but it barely lifted the corners of her mouth. I caught the way she swallowed hard, the way she blinked rapidly as if trying to steady herself. Heat gathered under my ribs, crawling upward, not anger yet but something close. The laughter continued as they cleaned the floor and tossed empty cans into a trash bag. Mark strutted past me, victorious, as if the prank had been a performance meant to impress someone. He leaned toward Jenny and whispered something he thought I would not hear. He's already tense. Wait till we get to the gifts. His voice carried a smug certainty that made my jaw tighten. Jenny paused, glanced at me briefly, then looked away. She did not intervene, but the unease in her posture said she knew the joke had landed differently than expected. I guided Lila to the couch, wanting to check if she was steady enough to continue sitting in that room. Her breaths were shallow and her fingers curled tightly into the fabric of her dress. I placed a hand on her arm to ground her. The noise around us faded as my focus narrowed to her face. Her eyes lifted toward mine, soft with something fragile. Ethan. I've been through this before. She whispered. The words came from a place so deep it felt like she was confessing something she had tried to bury. Before I could form a question, before I could ask what memory the prank had dragged out of her, a chorus of voices rose around the tree. Come on, gifts time. Everybody sit down. Let's get this moving. And the back of just of now. The call echoed through the room, pulling her attention away and pulling me into a moment I already sensed would unravel everything we had tried to mend. The rustle of wrapping paper filled the room as everyone reached for the gifts I had brought. The atmosphere shifted from awkward recovery to bright anticipation. Noah shouted when he discovered his tablet, already tapping the screen as if it belonged to him for years. Sophie clutched hers to her chest and thanked me with a grin that felt sincere. Richard examined the new camping gear with approval, turning each piece over with the satisfaction of a man who rarely showed gratitude. Mark held up his upgraded set with a boastful laugh, as if he had earned it himself. Carol clipped the antique brooch to her sweater and marveled at the delicate design. Seeing them happy stirred something warm inside me, something close to relief. For a moment, I believed we were turning a corner, that maybe this one night would go smoothly. Then the room fell quiet, and every face turned toward me. The first package I opened revealed a plastic spatula with a crooked handle. I paused, unsure if it belonged to someone else, but the snickers around me confirmed it was mine. The next gift held garish green socks so bright they looked radioactive. The third was the one that made my breath stall. A used car mirror, still dusty, still scratched, for a car I no longer owned. The laughter erupted in full, loud enough to drown out the thudding in my chest. Phones rose like an audience capturing a performance they had been waiting for. Before I could form a response, Lila's turn came. She unwrapped her small package with careful fingers. Inside was a bottle of fart spray, cheap and crude, the kind sold as a novelty at gas stations. She stared at it, stunned. The room exploded again with laughter, sharper and more unrestrained this time. Mark clapped his hands and shouted, "Spray it, Lila. Let's christen Christmas the right way." His voice carried triumph. Lila placed the bottle on the floor gently and kept her head bowed. Her eyes shimmered, holding back a rush of emotion she refused to release in front of them. Carol leaned toward Richard with a chuckle, then addressed me loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "Oh, come on, Ethan. It's tradition. We thought you could take a joke." The words were coded in dismissal. I stood slowly, the weight of her statement settling onto my shoulders. "You told me no pranks." The room fell silent for a heartbeat before Mark broke it with a grin that matched the cruelty behind it. "We lied. That's the prank." His satisfaction grew as he watched my reaction. I left the room before my voice betrayed me. The hallway felt cooler, quieter, a pocket of space where I could breathe again. I found Lila leaning against the wall, her hands pressed to her face, her shoulders shook with silent tears. When she lowered her hands, her eyes were red, her voice trembling. "My ex's family used to do this. Humiliate me while smiling. I thought I left this behind, Ethan." Her words were soft but carried a weight that sank into me. My stomach dropped, and the realization hit with a force I had not anticipated. This was not a harmless prank for her. This was a wound they had torn open carelessly. I took a step closer, wanting to reach for her, but she shook her head gently. She needed a moment to stand on her own. I waited beside her until her breathing steadied, a quiet rhythm in the dim hallway. Her pain settled into me, shaping the anger I tried to contain. The house felt different now. Every laugh behind us sounded sharper, every voice a reminder of what she had endured. I knew we had to face them again, even if my patience hung by a thread. We walked back toward the living room together. The chatter quieted as we approached. Mark stood near the tree, his phone already raised, aimed directly at us. His grin widened as he pointed the camera in my direction. "Ready for round 2? He said, tapping the record button with deliberate satisfaction. Mark's phone hovered in front of us like a taunt, the red recording light blinking. I felt the tension in the room shift, thickening until I could barely swallow. He waited for a reaction, waited for the moment he could twist into a joke, waited for the version of me they used to push around. I stepped forward and held his gaze. Enough. This isn't funny. You crossed the line. My voice carried through the room with a weight that silenced even the kids. Mark lifted one shoulder in an easy shrug. Bro, it's a joke. You're acting ungrateful. His casual tone sharpened something inside me. Carol spoke before I could answer. You always were dramatic. This is why it was hard raising you. Her words landed so cleanly they knocked the breath out of me. They were spoken with that old familiar disdain, a reminder of the years I spent trying to earn even the smallest sliver of approval. The hurt settled under my ribs with a steady ache, colder than the silly string but far more lasting. Lila stood a few steps behind me, her voice soft but steady. Please stop filming. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture. She just asked, clearly and calmly, for a baseline of decency. Mark tilted the phone toward her face, the lens inches from her eyes. Why? Afraid someone will see your pretty cry face? His words cut through the space like a blade. The room erupted into laughter again, louder and more unrestrained. Each laugh chipped away at her composure. At my composure. At any hope that something meaningful could be salvaged from this night. I felt something shift inside me, a quiet but decisive break. My body moved before my thoughts caught up. I walked to the tree, leaning down to pick up the first gift I had brought. The wrapping still looked crisp, untouched. I set it aside and reached for the next. Jenny's voice broke through the noise with a sharp whisper. Mark, stop him. She sounded alarmed, but Mark's smirk deepened. He folded his arms and watched as if this was the entertainment he had been waiting for. One by one, I gathered every box, every bag, every carefully chosen gift. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain. I stacked them with deliberate care, the same care I had taken when choosing them. The room's laughter faded into a stunned hush as they watched me reclaim each piece. Richard stepped away from the armchair, placing himself directly between me and the front door. His face carried a sternness he rarely used. You're not walking out with gifts meant for this family. I stood still, gifts in my hands, and met his eyes. The heaviness of the moment wrapped around us, pulling the air tight. They're mine, I said evenly. And so are my boundaries. The quiet confidence in my tone surprised even me. Richard's jaw tightened. The room felt ready to fracture. Mark pushed himself off the wall and stepped beside Richard, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of beer on his breath. His voice was low enough that the others leaned in, drawn by the same familiar pull toward conflict. Try it, Ethan. Let's see what happens. I tightened my grip on the stack of gifts, feeling the weight of each box pressing into my arms. Richard stood firm in the doorway, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I brushed past his shoulder, ignoring the sharp intake of breath behind me. Carol shouted my name with a mix of shock and offense, as if I had betrayed her instead of the other way around. Jenny's voice rose above the noise, yelling at Mark to stop making things worse, while Noah and Sophie cried without understanding why the room had turned so chaotic. Phones appeared again, recording my every step as I carried the gifts out to the car. The cold air outside felt harsh against my face, but it cleared my mind enough to keep walking. I loaded the bags into the trunk, closed it, and drove away without looking back. The next morning felt heavier than the night before. My phone vibrated non-stop, filling with messages from the family group chat. You ruined Christmas. The kids hate you. Grow up and apologize. Give the gifts back. Each text carried the same tone, the same refusal to acknowledge their part in what happened. I read through several before blocking the group entirely. The relief was immediate, though a thin ache lingered in my chest. The night had left a mark, and their words felt like an attempt to reshape the truth before it settled. At work, I talked quietly to my friend Eric during lunch, thinking the cafeteria was empty enough for a private conversation. I described the silly string, the cheap gifts, the filming, the way Lila had cried in the hallway. I kept my voice measured, mostly because speaking too loudly made the memory feel sharper. I did not notice the office gossip, Tessa, seated behind a pillar with her sandwich in hand. By the time I returned to my desk, curious glances followed me through the hall. Whispers clipped at the edges of conversations, and people exchanged looks when I passed. The story spread faster than I expected, and by mid-afternoon it had become the unofficial headline of the office. I had posted about the ordeal on Reddit the night before, needing a place to release the frustration without interruption. I never imagined anyone at work would connect the details. A coworker who followed Mark on social media must have recognized the names and descriptions. They sent him a link to the post without hesitation. My phone rang as I was locking my apartment door after work. Mark's number flashed across the screen. I answered, expecting an argument, but I did not expect the intensity in his voice. You humiliated our whole family, he shouted. Fix it right now. His rage slurred some of the words, making them spill out unevenly. He insisted I take the post down and tell everyone I exaggerated. His anger hit me like a storm, loud and chaotic. I listened long enough to realize he was not interested in hearing my side. He wanted control. I hung up in the middle of his tirade and turned off my phone for the rest of the evening. Later, when I turned it back on, a single call came through from Jenny. Her voice trembled when she spoke, a soft contrast to the uproar earlier. "Ethan, I didn't know it was this bad. How long has he treated you like this?" Her tone carried genuine confusion, maybe even guilt. I leaned back on my couch, feeling some of the tension ease. Hearing concern instead of blame shifted the atmosphere around me. She waited for my answer, breathing unevenly as if bracing for something she wished she had known before. Before I could speak, a shout erupted through the phone's speaker. Mark's voice thundered in the background, raw with fury. "Jenny, hang up that phone right now." Jenny's call ended abruptly after Mark shouted in the background, and for the rest of the night I kept replaying her shaken voice. By morning, the meaning behind it unfolded. Jenny confronted Mark as soon as he walked into the kitchen. She demanded to know why he treated me the way he did. Why he acted as if cruelty was a hobby. Mark denied everything with the same confidence he used to taunt me as a kid, brushing off her questions as exaggerations. Jenny told him plainly that she was done pretending his behavior was harmless. She said they needed therapy or distance. He scoffed and called her dramatic. That bravado vanished when she packed bags, woke the kids, and drove to her parents' house without looking back. 2 days later, a pounding on my door ripped through the quiet of midnight. I opened it to find Mark swaying on the porch. His eyes were glassy, his clothes disheveled, and the smell of alcohol clung to him. He jabbed a finger toward my chest and shouted, "You ruined my marriage. You're a selfish little brat." His voice slurred, but his anger had a vicious clarity. He ranted about Jenny leaving, about the kids crying, about how everyone was calling him out. He blamed all of it on me, each accusation spewing with more desperation than logic. I stood there, letting the words land without responding. When his shouting grew louder, I stepped back inside and called Richard and Carol. When they arrived, their faces held pure embarrassment, their eyes avoiding mine as they helped him into their car. The chaos spread farther than I expected. Word traveled through the extended family within days. At first, several aunts and cousins defended Richard and Carol, insisting I must have misunderstood the prank, that my parents had always loved me, that I should have handled everything more gracefully. Then they read the full Reddit post. One by one, their voices changed. The tone shifted from judgment to disbelief, then to anger directed at the people who raised me. Messages arrived from relatives I had not spoken to in years, saying they were ashamed of how I had been treated, apologizing on behalf of a family system they now realized had been warped for a long time. By the end of the week, Richard and Carol reached out again, asking for one final conversation. They said it was important. They said they wanted to talk face to face. I hesitated, but Lila placed her hand on my arm and said she would go with me. Her presence steadied me as we drove to their house. When we walked in, my parents were seated side by side on the couch, both quiet, both tense. They looked older in that moment, not from age but from the weight of having to face what they tried to avoid for years. I sat across from them with Lila beside me. For the first time, I told them everything. I spoke through years of favoritism, the subtle digs, the way achievements were brushed aside, the constant comparisons to Mark, the silence that followed every time I needed support. I described the feeling of being tolerated rather than loved, how the holiday prank was not an isolated incident but a culmination of what they had always expected me to endure. They listened without interrupting, their expressions shifting from discomfort to resignation. When I finished, I asked the question that had lived inside me for years. Why was I always the one left out? The room stayed silent long enough to turn my pulse into a drumbeat. Carol's hands twisted in her lap before she finally looked up. Her voice was soft but carried a heaviness that pressed into the space between us. "You weren't planned. We weren't ready. And we did not know how to love you the same way." She exhaled shakily, her eyes glistening. "We thought you would grow into the difference. You never did. And we handled that wrong from the start." The words constricted everything inside me. They settled like stones in my chest, reshaping memories with a clarity that hurt more than any prank ever could. Lila reached for my hand, grounding me as the truth settled. I looked at them again, feeling a cold steadiness replace the initial shock. Were your apologies ever real, or were they just bait to pull me back into the same cycle? Richard lowered his gaze to the carpet as if the pattern there could offer a way out of the truth. Carol covered her mouth with her hands, shoulders shaking, the tears slipping through her fingers with no attempt to hide them. Neither of them spoke. Neither even tried. Their silence pressed against the walls, dense enough to feel like another presence in the room. I waited for an explanation that would not come. Their lack of an answer was its own confession, and the weight of that realization tightened against my ribs. Something inside me settled into a stillness that felt unnerving. When I began to speak, my voice came out steady, almost measured. A stark contrast to the chaos their behavior had unleashed for years. You turned me into a joke, a scapegoat, a placeholder for blame you didn't want to face. The words slipped into the quiet like stones dropping into deep water. Mark stood near the doorway. His posture finally stripped of swagger. He swallowed hard, then whispered. I didn't know. I just followed their lead. His voice cracked around the edges, not with remorse but with disbelief at his own admission. Jenny stepped up behind him, her expression sharp with clarity she had gained only recently. And you nearly lost your family because of it, she said, each syllable cold enough to freeze the air around her. Mark's shoulders curled inward as if bracing for a blow he knew was deserved. He looked from Jenny to his parents and then back to me, but no words followed. His silence showed that he finally understood the damage he had helped create. Lila stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her voice wavered at first, but she pushed through it, letting determination anchor her words. What you did brought back years of humiliation I suffered in my past. You didn't just prank Ethan. You rewounded me. The room shifted with her confession, every person suddenly more aware of the cost of their behavior. Mark's throat bobbed as he gulped, his face paling. He offered no excuse, no explanation. He stood there exposed, finally feeling the depth of the harm. Carol lifted her head, eyes swollen and red. She tried to speak, but I raised my hand lightly, stopping her before she could repeat a pattern I had heard since childhood. This is your last chance, I said. If you want to rebuild anything with me, it starts with honesty, and ending the cycle. The urgency in my tone rippled through the room. The years of silence, the years of letting things slide, the years of being pushed aside had converged into one clear ultimatum. The room fell completely silent. Even the faint hum of the heating system seemed to fade. Everyone waited for someone else to break the stillness. Lila reached for my hand, grounding me. Jenny let out a slow breath, bracing for whatever responses would follow. Mark stared at the floor as if he could disappear into it. Carol looked shattered, and Richard still had not lifted his eyes. Then, quietly but with a firmness I did not expect, Richard finally spoke. Tell us how to start over. When the house finally fell quiet and the dust of all the arguments settled, I gathered every gift I had reclaimed and placed them in the back of my truck. I drove them to a local charity the next morning. Handing them over felt more final than any confrontation I had with my family, as if I was letting go of the last thread tying me to a version of myself that tolerated anything to keep the peace. Watching the volunteers carry the boxes inside brought a strange sense of clarity. The gifts had been chosen with love, but the people they were meant for had turned them into weapons. Giving them away became its own closure, a clean break from a holiday that went so wrong it revealed everything buried beneath years of silence. Over the next few weeks, my relationship with Noah and Sophie slowly changed. They approached me cautiously at first, unsure if I was still angry. Unsure if I would pull away from them the way I pulled from the adults. But children understand sincerity better than most. They came to me with questions about school and their drawings, and eventually they asked about Lila. When they hugged me again, it felt gentle, unclouded by the tension that hovered between the grown-ups. The hurt had not disappeared, but something softer began to take root, something that suggested hope could return in quiet pieces rather than grand gestures. Mark's transformation came in uneven steps. After Jenny returned home with the kids, she insisted on therapy, and this time he agreed. She watched every session schedule, every appointment made, every effort he claimed to put in. She was determined to ensure the cycle ended before it swallowed their own children. The pranks that once defined their family gatherings fell away entirely, leaving an unexpected silence where mockery used to be. That silence gave room for reflection, and although Mark still struggled with facing the truth, he began to shift in small ways that mattered. My birthday arrived in March. I chose a small pizza parlor near my place, keeping the celebration simple. When my parents and Mark walked in, they looked nervous, almost hesitant. None of them carried wrapped gifts or bags. Instead, Richard handed me a large card with a crisp $100 bill tucked inside. The message was an apology written in their own uneven handwriting. Lila later whispered that it was the first honest thing they had given me in years. Carol stepped forward and held out a pair of sterling silver earrings for Lila. The gesture was awkward, almost clumsy, but sincerity lived beneath the effort. Lila accepted them with a soft nod, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, I believed my family was trying to understand the impact of their choices. In the weeks that followed, our interactions remained measured. We talked, but with caution. We met, but without pretending everything was suddenly flawless. The old patterns lurked at the edges, but this time everyone recognized them before they had a chance to return. The family I grew up with was still there, but in pieces. We were stitching ourselves together again, one thread at a time, with attention instead of habit, with honesty instead of denial. We will never be perfect. We may never be the kind of family that laughs effortlessly or understands each other without trying. Yet the peace forming between us no longer felt like something forced onto me. It felt earned. It felt like a bridge built from both sides rather than one person standing in the middle hoping the others might meet him there. And for the first time, I felt I was living on my own terms. I was no longer bending, no longer shrinking myself to fit into the shape they wanted. I was simply standing where I needed to, and they were learning how to meet me there. When I look back at everything that happened, the lesson is clear. Boundaries matter. Compassion is not the same as tolerance. And healing requires truth. No matter how uncomfortable. My family taught me that love is not proven by blood but by behavior, and sometimes it takes hitting a breaking point to discover what relationships are worth rebuilding. If this story resonates with you, share it with someone who needs strength to stand their ground. Follow the channel for more real stories that remind us that change is possible, healing is complicated, and no one has to walk through it alone.